I'm Dilek Tuna. You're watching A News. Let's take a look at today's top stories. Venezuelan Nobel Peace Prize winner Maria Corina Machado presents her medal to Donald Trump. The US President announces a board of peace for Gaza members to be revealed soon. And the UN Security Council holds an emergency meeting on Iran after the US request. Venezuelan opposition leader Maria Corina Machado said her meeting with US President Donald Trump on Thursday was excellent. She presented her Nobel Peace Prize medal to him. It was their first face-to-face meeting since Venezuela's longtime leader Nicolas Maduro was captured earlier this month.
Venezuelan opposition leader Maria Corina Machado and US President Donald Trump had lunch together on Thursday at the White House. Machado gave her Nobel Peace Prize medal to him, saying the gift was in recognition of what she called his commitment to the freedom of the Venezuelan people. She's trying to gain some influence over how the president shapes the South American country's political future.
We were able to calmly discuss the expectations and dreams of Venezuelans, the difficult times we are experiencing, but at the same time full of hope for the changes to come. I conveyed to him the determination and commitment of Venezuelan society to fight for a transition that will not only allow us to build democratic, solid and stable institutions, but also to address the most important issue, which is our people, not only in terms of freedoms and the violation of political prisoners, guarantees of free expression, freedom of movement and freedom of organization, but also addressing the enormous humanitarian crisis in Venezuela due to the situation of income, lack of employment, and the collapse of security, health, and education.
A White House official confirmed that Trump intends to keep the medal. He described the moment as a wonderful gesture of mutual respect in a social media post. The talks come as Venezuela's political future remains uncertain, with opposition figures pushing for a democratic transition and Washington weighing who could play a role in governing the country. The White House reiterated that President Trump maintains a cautious view of Machado's ability to lead Venezuela in the short term to replace the deposed Nicolas Maduro, citing questions over her level of support inside the country.
The United States has seized another oil tanker tied to Venezuela in a pre-dawn operation in the Caribbean. The US military claimed the vessel was taken without incident and had been operating in defiance of a maritime quarantine on sanctioned ships. It's the sixth tanker intercepted in recent weeks, coming just ahead of the meeting held between US President Donald Trump and Venezuelan opposition leader Maria Corina Machado. Cuba paid tribute to 32 soldiers killed in combat during a US military operation targeting Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro in early January. President Miguel Diaz-Canel presided over a final guard of honor in Havana. The remains of the soldiers arrived early on Thursday at Havana's International Airport. They were members of Cuba's armed forces and intelligence agencies. The tribute is set to conclude on Friday with funerals in the victims' respective cities. US President Donald Trump has threatened to deploy military forces in Minnesota after days of angry protests over a surge in immigration agents on the streets of Minneapolis. The warning to invoke the Insurrection Act came just hours after an immigration officer shot a Venezuelan man in the leg. Authorities say the officer fired in defense. Violent protests have since spread to other cities after last week's fatal shooting of a woman by an immigration and customs enforcement agent in the same city. US President Donald Trump announced that the long-awaited Board of Peace to oversee Gaza's reconstruction has officially been formed, and the board's members will be revealed shortly. Trump says he's backing a newly formed Palestinian technocratic body to govern Gaza during phase 2 of the transition period. In a post on his Truth social media platform on Thursday, Trump said the move marks the next step of the 20-point peace plan following the ceasefire agreed last October. He said the National Committee for the Administration of Gaza would oversee the territory's transition, focusing on humanitarian assistance and stability. Trump also said the plan includes a comprehensive demilitarization agreement with Hamas, supported by Egypt, Turkey and Qatar. Hamas has agreed to hand over control of Gaza to the newly formed Technocratic Committee. To the Middle East now, Palestinians in Gaza are reacting with anger and disbelief after the US announced the launch of the second phase of its plan to end the war. Many say conditions on the ground show there's been no real progress at all.
Frustration and skepticism are spreading among displaced Palestinians in Gaza after the United States announced it was moving ahead with a second phase of its plan to end the war. For many, the announcement feels disconnected from what they say is still happening on the ground. People forced from their homes by months of fighting say there has been no visible change in daily life, with airstrikes continuing and basic needs still unmet.
What second phase or first phase? They haven't even started the first phase yet. How can they start with the second? They've been bombing since this morning. They targeted Tufa and Zaytun. Houses are coming down. Which second phase?
This is the enemy. What do you expect of it? To open the crossing? It's all lies, all empty talk of opening the crossing and doing this or that. And what did they let through? Cola? Is cola what we need?
Israel says hundreds of aid trucks are entering Gaza each day with food, medical supplies, and shelter materials. But international aid groups argue the deliveries fall far short of what is needed. The second phase, announced by US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, calls for a transitional technocratic Palestinian administration in Gaza, alongside steps toward disarmament and reconstruction. The proposed 15-member body would be led by former Palestinian Authority official Ali Sharth and overseen by an international board under a plan agreed by Israel and Hamas last October.
French President Emmanuel Macron has warned that Europe must be ready to respond to growing security risks as pressure mounts over Greenland. In a speech to the armed forces, he stressed the need for military readiness and stronger defence capabilities across France and its allies.
Groenland, territoire autonome du Royaume de Danemark.
In Greenland, an autonomous territory of the Kingdom of Denmark, Europeans have a particular responsibility because this territory belongs to the European Union and is also that of one of our NATO allies. France has decided to join the exercise that was scheduled and launched by Denmark in a sovereign and independent manner as part of Arctic Endurance. A first team of French soldiers is already on site and will be reinforced in the coming days by land, air and sea means.
Et sera renforcé dans les prochains jours par des moyens terrestres.
Portugal is facing an uncertain outcome in this Sunday's presidential vote, with no clear favourite emerging among the top candidates. Recent polls show a tight race and suggest the contest is likely to go to a runoff for the first time in 40 years.
Portuguese voters will head to the polling stations on Sunday, knowing the presidential election will likely end up in a rare runoff, the first in 40 years. It comes as political fragmentation leaves the race wide open. A recent poll shows far-right candidate André Ventura, leader of the opposition party Chega, slightly ahead with 24% of voting intentions. He's closely followed by socialist Antonio José Seguro on 23%, while João Coutrinho de Figueiredo of the Liberal Initiative is close behind within the poll's 2.2% margin of error. Two other candidates, including Social Democratic Party-backed Luis Marques Mendes, each have 14%, keeping the contest among the top five extremely close. Smaller polls in recent days have shown similar tight margins, highlighting the uncertainty of the outcome.
The days ahead will be really challenging, and the result is unexpected. What is certainly expected is that we will have to go to a second round.
The Portuguese presidency, while largely ceremonial, carries important powers, including the ability to dissolve parliament and call snap elections. Despite Ventura's lead, his rejection rate of more than 60% suggests he would lose in a runoff against any of the other top contenders, leaving the final result uncertain.
Japan's Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi met Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni in Tokyo on Friday as the two countries move to strengthen bilateral ties. Speaking after the talks, Takaichi said the two leaders had agreed to elevate relations to a special strategic partnership, citing shared values and long-standing cooperation. Meloni said the discussions focused on economic security, including efforts to safeguard strategic technologies and strengthen global supply chains. The two leaders also highlighted cooperation beyond Asia and Europe, pointing to shared engagement in Africa. The visit comes as Japan and Italy mark 160 years of diplomatic relations. Canada and China agreed to pursue a new strategic partnership during talks between Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney and Chinese President Xi Jinping in Beijing on Friday. Carney said the partnership could deliver historic gains by building on both countries' strengths, particularly in agriculture, energy, agri-food and finance. The visit, the first by a Canadian Prime Minister since 2017, comes as Ottawa seeks to reset ties with its second largest trading partner amid US tariffs on Canadian goods. China is also looking to deepen cooperation with a G7 country as it faces renewed trade pressure from Washington. This summer in Australia, teenagers have had to find other things to do instead of scrolling on social media after a ban for under 16-year-olds began a month ago. Official figures show that nearly 5 million accounts have been deactivated.
Nearly 5 million Australian social media accounts belonging to teenagers have been deactivated. It's just more than a month since Australia took a world-first step to ban under 16-year-olds from accessing social media platforms. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese praised the initiative.
Today we can announce that this is working. 4.7 million accounts gone, suspended, stopped, meaning that young people, instead of being on their devices during these school holidays, have been cycling around facilities such as this, have been reading books, have been engaging with their friends and family on a one-to-one basis, interacting, making an enormous difference to them. It has given as well parents that peace of mind of not worrying about what their children are looking at online.
Children and parents won't face penalties for breaking the rules. Instead, social media companies could be fined up to $33 million for serious or repeated breaches. The tally of 4.7 million accounts is far higher than was originally estimated. It equates to more than 2 accounts for every Australian aged between 10 and 16 years old, based on population data.
I'm very confident these numbers are right, but we will continue to check. We have a whole range of research methods that we'll be looking at to make sure that the data that is given to us is right.
The rollout of the ban is being closely watched by regulators around the world. France, Malaysia and Indonesia have said they will introduce similar laws, while several European countries and US states are also considering following Australia's lead.
We'll take a short break now, and when we return, we'll discuss high-level talks between the United States and Venezuela and the questions they raise about diplomacy, legitimacy and power. Stay with us. Welcome back to A News. Now, US President Donald Trump has held a closed-door meeting at the White House with Venezuelan opposition leader Maria Corina Machado, who presented him with her Nobel Peace Prize medal. At the same time, Washington has secured a reported $500 million oil deal with Venezuela through talks with interim President Delcy Rodriguez. Let's bring in our guest, Nuno Wanon Martins, a political analyst from Brussels, Belgium. Nuno, welcome to the program.
Hi, thank you very much for inviting me.
Now let's look at symbolism here first. Maria Corina Machado gave President Trump her Nobel Peace Prize medal. What message was she trying to send, and to whom?
Look, first and foremost, I think she's trying to please President Trump. Secondly, according to reports by Reuters, President Trump clearly said he didn't got the prize belongs to Maria Corina Machado. And thirdly, I think that we are looking to the fait divers of the issue rather than to understand the long-term situation that they are trying to end here. And this is how I see it. As you can see by the reports that came out after the meeting, not much was said, and what was said, as I said before, it's fait divers. It's basically talking about nothing important, taking in consideration the future of Venezuela and the future of the freedom movement that is led by Mrs. Machado.
Okay. Now, like you said, not much has been said, yet anyway. This meeting was held privately. Does that increase its political weight, or does it raise questions about transparency?
No, absolutely not. It's not about transparency. I think the attitude and what President Trump is doing, in my view, is in the right way, because he's not saying exactly what he envisages for Venezuela, and by the same to Iran. Because look, the question is very much the following: we had in the past American interventions, and the follow-up the day after ended up very badly. Look at Afghanistan, the situation in Iraq was no better. This is one thing. The second thing, we have the international law, as everybody likes to apply, but the international law created and helped and supported and defended regimes like Iran and Venezuela, which were basically financing movements around the world who were basically contracting American power in the world, especially in the Western Hemisphere. So what can we do afterwards? Are we going to repeat the errors of the past? Are we going to have a different attitude? Even though it's not clearly said by the administration, in my view, the idea is to see what is feasible the day after Maduro fell. Secondly, do you want regime change, and is the opposition has the opposition the sufficient power to take power? And those are the questions that you have to consider. It's not easy to put just a leader because she has been the opposition leader for the past 5, 6, 7 years. You really have to understand, because if this leader is to put in power and it doesn't create a strong and develops Venezuela in the right path, she will be seen in the future as the puppet of the United States. And I don't think this is good for the United States. This is no good for Venezuela, and this is not good for the world, or for the Western world as it is. Okay. And you can also apply this to more or less the same to the question in Iran, but this is something different.
But Nuno, by meeting an opposition leader while also negotiating with Venezuela's interim government, is Washington trying to speak to both sides, or is it undermining its own position here?
I don't think so. I think the position, well, the idea of changing Maduro by Delcy Rodriguez and to keep Delcy Rodriguez in power and meeting Mrs. Machado is to give, in my view, a strong message to Mrs. Rodriguez. Do not forget that at the same time that the Americans are keeping Mrs. Rodriguez, they are assaulting Venezuelan vessels transporting oil. So what does it mean? It means that the pressure are being trespassed to the Venezuelan government. Which type of pressure? Well, in my view, first and foremost, the pressure of applying and concealing with the rules of the American power. Secondly, most probably pressure, because that is going to be the interesting part of it. How this current government in Venezuela will evolve, will develop into a combination to democracy first, and second, in leading with the opposition. And I do believe that who holds the power in Venezuela, the army and Mrs. Rodriguez at the moment, they will have to consider what they want in the future, because let's face it, if the power changes in Venezuela for the opposition, either you'll have a civil war, nobody wants it. Secondly, even if the current government loses, which accusations Mrs. Rodriguez will face? She will also have to consider that, in my view. So all of this, I do not think that he's playing into different chairs, Mr. Trump, but he's putting pressure on the current government of Venezuela, acknowledging at the same time that if the opposition wants to get into democracy and to power, it needs to build a stronger relationship and it has more power within the country.
Okay, and the White House has reportedly secured a $500 million oil deal with Venezuela now. How much does energy security now shape US policy toward Caracas?
Look, I think the message about that, first and foremost, is more about the relationship that Caracas had with both Russia and China, and the fact that Caracas, within Chavez and Maduro regime, moved away from the US. And this deal is to show more and foremost, because also you have the difficulties regarding the oil business in Venezuela and the development and a certain, let's say, constraint by American oil companies to invest in Venezuela. But to show that what Mr. Trump is saying, it's going to be the development of his words and the development of the future between Venezuela and the relationship between Venezuela and the United States of America. So I think that clearly you have to consider the modern application of the Monroe Doctrine, and that in terms of energy, the Trump administration is very much focused on controlling the energy in the Western Hemisphere and both in South America.
Okay, and after these talks, what has actually changed for Washington, for Caracas, and for the opposition beyond access?
No, that's a very good question. It's a very good, it's a very difficult answer, because to be honest with you, I do believe that they must, for sure, there will be some talks on how to involve the situation in Venezuela. And the fact that Mrs. Rodriguez is releasing prisoners, it's also a very good sign. And it's also releasing prisoners, so this also helps the opposition. I do believe that the future is also to see a negotiation between the Venezuelan army and the opposition leaders, because who holds at the end of the day the power in Venezuela is the army. And let's face it, the Maduro capture was done with people inside and most probably from people within the Venezuelan army that helped the American forces to get into Venezuela. And in my view, that will be the next step. I think that Mrs. Rodriguez will stay in power for the time being, but the idea is to develop a stronger opposition, to develop a path to democracy with the different groups, and to see how to evolve. Eventually, I would even say that the Chavista movement will become a party in the future in Venezuela.
How much real influence does Maria Corina Machado have inside Venezuela, given her strong backing among the diaspora but more limited reach at home?
Well, this is a very, very good question, and a very good question very difficult to answer, because you can say the same thing about the son of the former Shah Pahlavi in Iran, which is the following. There is a difference here. Mrs. Machado has been in Venezuela. They have their support, but it is difficult to get support in a country which is controlled by not only by the state but by the army and by the regional forces. Also the composition of the Venezuelan political system allows that to enforce somehow the central government through the regional governments. And the question is exactly that. It is very difficult to measure the support for Mrs. Machado. I think more or less the country must be more or less split, or would say 55-60% for Mrs. Machado, 40% for the government. But the government has elements of power, not only within the people, but within the government itself, that allows them to be very strong and to impose certain tools that can please certain parts of the people who would support the government afterwards. And that's where it's very difficult to see where the support of Mrs. Machado can be at this moment.
And Nuno, how are other Latin American countries, in your view, likely to interpret Washington's dual engagement?
Oh, you have to understand that you have two types of attitudes. You have a pattern towards a more right-wing governments. You saw that in Chile, you have El Salvador, you have Bolivia. So this is the pattern, and those who are more on the left are facing pressure. Now, if you consider Cuba, for instance, Cuba is very much under pressure because Cuba was depending on Venezuelan oil. And now with this, they probably are facing, and you can see already by the narrative of the president of Cuba that is claiming that maybe some of the problems they have in Cuba belongs to themselves, and they created those problems from foreign forces that put Cuba in the situation that it is today. On the other hand, next elections also will put pressure on who is going to be elected, and clearly candidates who have a view which is closer to President Trump will be much more likely to be elected than those who are against. You have one exception, which is Brazil, in my view, also because Brazil, as the other countries, are very much divided 50-50%. And the question is to see how strong the Brazilian president will be in order to continue trying to avoid the pressure by the American administration on one hand. So far he has been successful. And I think that the success of all of these will be how they will deal in terms of negotiations and in terms of business oriented they will be to deal with the United States and with this current administration.
Okay, and finally, Nuno, is Washington trading long-term influence for short-term strategic gains here? What's your analysis?
It's very hard to say because you can claim both ways. I would claim on the first way that this is a short-term for two reasons, because the Trump administration is short-term administration. It's his second presidency of President Trump, so naturally he won't run for a third mandate. That's the first thing. So therefore he's looking for a short-term presidency view, but the consequences of his policies can be longer. I would say that in certain ways he's positioning himself as an obstacle to the development of China, of the Chinese interests globally, especially the development of the Belt and Road policy that China has been implementing in the past decades. And he has done so because, in my view, the previous American administrations have done very little to counterweight the Chinese and the Russians. And now this is, again, the view of President Trump is the only way of counteracting this for now and for the long term. That's why I have difficulties to say if these policies are a short-term mindset or if they have a longer view.
Okay, Nuno, thank you so much for joining us. It's always a pleasure. I appreciate your insight.
Thank you so much. Have a nice day. Have a nice weekend.
You too.
Pleasure is mine.
After the break, we'll take a look at major stories from the region. Stay with us.
world business, we meet the boardroom leaders making market-moving decisions. And find out how leaders are dealing with continuous technological disruption.
Welcome back to A News. Now let's take a closer look at the key stories shaping the region. An international conference is underway in Baku on Friday, putting a global spotlight on allegations of racism, repression and violence against Sikhs and other minority communities in India. Our correspondent Aysel Ibrahimova has more.
An international conference is taking place in Baku, focusing on the situation of Sikhs and other minority groups in India. Organized by the Baku Initiative Group, the event is titled Racism and the Violence Against Sikhs and Other Minorities in India, Current Realities, and examines allegations of discrimination and human rights concerns. The conference brings together participants from several countries, including representatives of the Sikh diaspora from the United Kingdom, Canada and the United States, as well as academics and analysts. Ramesh Singh Arora, Punjab's Minister for Human Rights and Minorities, is among the speakers. Discussions highlight how current Indian government actions allegedly violate several United Nations conventions regarding civil rights and torture. Delegates are calling for international organizations to keep these human rights issues high on the global agenda. There is a specific demand for the United Nations Human Rights Committee to investigate extrajudicial killings and document ongoing abuses. The event also highlights the role of non-governmental organizations and researchers in shaping international debate. Participants note the historical background of Sikhism, which emphasizes equality, and ongoing calls by activists for recognition of the 1984 anti-Sikh violence and for further investigation into those events.
The US called for an emergency meeting of the United Nations Security Council on Thursday following deadly anti-government protests in Iran, as US President Donald Trump warns of military intervention, whilst Tehran says it will retaliate in equal proportion.
There were calls for calm at the United Nations Security Council held on Thursday over the deadly protests in Iran. It's after reports of thousands of deaths during the unrest in the last few weeks. Iranian journalist and political dissident Masih Alinejad broke down in tears as she read out the names of people she said were killed during the demonstrations.
Negin Qadimi, 20 years old. She died in her father's arms after being shot by the Revolutionary Guards member. I feel guilty that I don't name the rest. The list of names goes on and on. They knew they will face guns and bullets, but they wanted justice.
US Ambassador to the United Nations Mike Waltz told the Council that Trump supports the people of Iran. He blamed the Iranian government for the unrest, which he said began late last year due to economic decline.
President Donald J. Trump and the United States of America stands by the brave people of Iran, period. And regardless of its excuses, and you will hear many today from the Iranian regime and from its friends, the regime is solely responsible for the economic misery of the Iranian people and the repression of their freedom, and they will be held accountable.
Waltz also addressed allegations by Tehran that the US and Israel are fueling the unrest and exploiting it for political gain.
Everyone in the world needs to know that the regime is weaker than ever before and therefore is putting forward this lie because of the power of the Iranian people in the streets. Colleagues, let me be clear. President Trump is a man of action, not endless talk like we see at the United Nations. He has made it clear all options are on the table to stop the slaughter. And no one should know that better than the leadership of the Iranian regime.
Iran called Trump's threats a violation of international law and warned of retaliation.
Iran seeks neither escalation nor confrontation. However, any act of aggression, direct or indirect, will be met with a decisive, proportionate, and lawful response under Article 51 of the Charter. This is not a threat. It is a statement of legal reality. Responsibility for all consequences will rest solely with those who initiate such unlawful acts.
On Thursday, Trump adopted a wait-and-see posture, saying he had been told the killings were easing and that he believed there was no current plan for large-scale executions. The comments come as UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres urged maximum restraint, calling on all actors to refrain from any actions that could lead to further loss of life or trigger a wider regional escalation.
Martial law has been imposed in the northwestern Iranian city of Tabriz, according to information shared by the Telegram channel Free Iran. Under the new measures, residents are not allowed to leave their homes after 8 p.m. local time. Reports indicate that the Grand Bazaar of Tabriz, one of the city's main commercial centres, has been closed, along with large grocery stores. While a number of small shops are still operating on a limited basis, movement remains restricted and access to essential goods has become more difficult for many residents. Representatives of Armenia and Azerbaijan on the 15th of January conducted a joint inspection of the current condition of the Yeresk-Sederak railway section. The Ministry of Territorial Administration and Infrastructure of Armenia said in a statement. The inspection aimed to assess the technical suitability of the railway section for the movement of specialised railway construction equipment in order to implement comprehensive measures for the restoration of the infrastructure. During the inspection, the parties exchanged views on the technical condition of the railway infrastructure along the section. Azerbaijan state oil company Sokar has begun supplying Azerbaijani natural gas to Austria and Germany, marking a new phase in the country's gas exports to Europe. Sokar said the supplies are being delivered via the Trans-Adriatic pipeline, the European segment of the Southern Gas Corridor, allowing Azerbaijani gas to reach southern and central European markets. The deliveries, routed through Italy, expand Azerbaijan's geographic gas footprint in Europe, bringing the total number of countries receiving Azerbaijani gas to 16. Kazakhstan is adjusting its oil export routes amid ongoing disruptions to the Caspian Pipeline Consortium, a critical artery for the country's energy exports. The changes follow a series of attacks and operational restrictions that have raised concerns over supply security and budgetary risks. Our correspondent reports.
Kazakhstan is redirecting its oil exports amid ongoing restrictions on the Caspian Pipeline Consortium, the key route that carries up to 80% of the country's crude exports. In late December, around 300,000 tons of oil were redirected via alternative routes through the Castrans oil system. Supplies were sent to Germany, China, along the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan corridor, and through the Russian ports of Novorossiysk and Ust-Luga. Kazakhstan's national oil company says these measures will continue into January 2026 as long as restrictions remain in place. At the same time, Kazakhstan is increasing deliveries to Europe. In 2025, exports to Germany reached 2.1 million tons, while with volumes expected to rise to 2.5 million tons next year. Oil shipments to China remain stable, totaling 1.1 million tons last year. Tensions escalated after an attack on the Caspian Pipeline Consortium on November 29th last year. Kazakhstan's foreign ministry described the incident as an act of aggression and lodged an official protest. In mid-December, the energy minister confirmed losses of 480,000 tons, but said the annual production and export targets would still be met. In January this year, the situation worsened. Drones targeted two tankers preparing to load Kazakh oil, causing damage while the vessels were awaiting loading. And according to experts, continued attacks along this route could lead to significant financial losses for the state budget. They argue that the current situation calls not for temporary measures or emergency fixes, but for a systematic long-term diversification strategy. Fariza Kalimurzina, Almaty, A News.
Russia has underlined its recognition of Afghanistan's current authorities as President Vladimir Putin received the credentials of Afghanistan's ambassador in Moscow and made fresh remarks on the future of Russian-Afghan relations. The recognition itself came last year, but the ceremony and Putin's comments mark a new diplomatic moment. Our correspondent Tamim Bahis has the latest from Kabul.
At a ceremony in the Kremlin, the ambassador of Afghanistan to Russia, Gul Hassan Hassan, officially presented his credential to President Vladimir Putin. The event was held alongside the reception of letters of credence from ambassadors of several other countries. But it was President Putin's remarks during the ceremony that have drawn particular attention. The Russian leader said that cooperation between Russia and Afghanistan has gained momentum in recent years, linking the progress to Moscow's decision last year to recognize Afghanistan's new authorities. Putin described the move as laying the groundwork for stronger political and economic engagement, suggesting that relations between the two sides are now entering a more structured and formal stage. He also referred to Afghanistan's observer status in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, reaffirming Russia's interest in seeing the country emerge as a united, independent and peaceful state. In his words, Moscow wants to see an Afghanistan free from war, terrorism and drug trafficking, comments that underline Russia's broader regional security priorities as it deepens engagement with Kabul. For Afghanistan, the credential ceremony carries strong symbolic weight, reinforcing the diplomatic legitimacy gained with Russia's recognition last year and translating it into a more visible official relationship. Tamim Bahis in Kabul, A News.
A short break now, and when we return, we'll look at the latest situation in Iran and new US sanctions linked to the crackdown on protests. Stay with us. Welcome back to A News. The United States has imposed new sanctions on Iran's influential security chief and several senior military officers, accusing them of responsibility for a deadly crackdown on nationwide protests. The move signals a sharper US response as unrest continues inside Iran, raising questions about accountability, deterrence, and whether sanctions can meaningfully influence behaviour on the ground. Let's bring in our guest, Associate Professor Dr. Zaur Gasimov, from Turkish-German University, joining us from Istanbul, Turkey. Doctor, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Now, why target Iran's top security and military figures now? What's Washington intending to do, or what message is Washington trying to send?
Well, that is the next step. The whole situation around and in Iran just let enter, let us say, that shows that the United States are observing the situation in and around the country with great attention. In the same time, it's a step which is not the most radical one. I mean, it's not a military operation or a similar measure one could really meet, but that shows that the situation is getting worse in Iran itself. The death tolls topped 2,500 people, according to another statistics, even 2,600. So the number of deaths is getting higher, and that is actually the next stop to identify the people responsible, co-responsible for that. So, and one has chosen the leading, the key persons in the appropriate authorities, Iranian authorities of Imperia and of security services, and really took the very concrete steps with this regard.
Do sanctions like these create real accountability, or are they symbolic once officials are already isolated?
They are symbolic. They are symbolic, and of course they touch these persons, but in the same time, I mean, the sanctions touch the bank account. They touch also the possibilities of traveling. But one couldn't now imagine that these persons intended now to travel to the West and on the margins of the process in Iran itself. But at the same time, that is a public step. And that has a symbolic feature, of course, and at the end we see that in the example of Russia and also other countries, of Iran itself, actually, that the sanctions and their impact is quite limited. But nevertheless, it's an important symbolic step.
But is there evidence that sanctioning individuals can actually deter further violence against protesters?
No, that's just a hope. That's a hope that others would follow the pattern and would feel somehow restricted or can see a certain eventual punishment for that, for them and for their family members. But the real guarantee for deterrence, there is no guarantee like that.
And how, Doctor, in your opinion, is Tehran likely to interpret this? As pressure to recalibrate, or as further justification to harden its stance?
Well, the political regime in Iran is under sanctions since 40, 45, 50 years, actually. And the quantity of sanctions is quite huge, maybe the hugest one. In the same time, the whole protests, the entire protest movement in Iran is portrayed by the pro-governmental newspapers, journals, TV channels, podcasts, and so on in Iran as an orchestrated measure directed from outside, so from the West. And that's why the sanctions are put discursively into this mosaic, so that it wouldn't change the rhetorics dramatically in Iran itself.
Okay, let's have a look at this from the protesters' perspective and the people of Iran who are directly impacted by what's happening with the current rule. Could external pressure like this strengthen the morale of the protesters, or does it risk giving the authorities a foreign interference narrative?
Well, the protest movement in Iran is a very heterogeneous one. So you don't have one movement, they are not represented by one party, and there is no leader of the protest movement, for example. So that's actually a very, very important issue, a very obvious weakness of the protest movement, which is a grassroots movement moved by the masses, but there is no one political leader. So for them, it's an important step, but maybe the most devoted part of the protesters or you can describe it as the most revolutionary or more radical part of the protest movement, would wish more concrete steps taken by the United States and its allies to support the protest movement. But at the moment, it's not the case, and that's a big question whether it would be the case in a couple of days. But what is very real with regard to the protest movement and to the political turmoil and social turmoil in Iran, that the death tolls would unfortunately grow in the next days.
And Doctor, how important is it whether European or regional partners follow the US lead on these sanctions?
Well, the key countries of the European Union actually took steps a couple of days ago, excluding Iranian diplomats from the, let us say, communication in Brussels and in Strasbourg and in other places, and maybe they would, highly likely they would join the US-led sanctions with regard to the key personalities and key functionaries within of the security services of Iran and the Ministry of Interior and so on and so on. But the European Union is perceived in Iran as a part of the so-called collective West, so it wouldn't change the situation dramatically.
As you said earlier, Doctor, Iran has lived under sanctions for decades. Is there a point at which additional sanctions lose their impact?
Well, the sanctions regime on the one hand and the effect of oil richness on the other hand are two very important factors which are able to lessen the impact of another. So sanctioning an oil-rich country is a tricky issue. Iran is not dependent on the taxes, for example, and Iran just selling oil and gas to the countries who didn't join the sanctions can still gain and can still have an access to financial sources. So that is an explanation for that. Iran really managed the 4 decades of sanctions and even was able to set up and to develop the proxy system in many countries of the Middle East.
And do you think these measures increase the risk of wider confrontation between Washington and Tehran?
Well, this one step actually should be perceived in the chain of measures the United States undertook and will undertake in the next days. And I wouldn't now pick out these sanctions and think that they play the role of the fulminating the whole relationship between Tehran and Washington, but that is very, very possible that we would see military confrontation in several days or weeks between US and.
Now, what does the US actually want to achieve here, Doctor? Behavior change, negotiation leverage, or long-term isolation?
Well, the long-term isolation is not possible with regard to Iran due to the situation around Russia and due to the current relationship between US and China, India, and other countries. So Iran still maintains quite close contact both with Russia and with the global South, and also with other countries in the region. But having said that, the sanctions aimed at weakening the regime and partly it was also achieved. So the economic performance of Iran got weaker and weaker from year to year. So the sanctions in itself, they can work in a long-term perspective. And they worked. So they somehow challenged the government to a large extent. And you shouldn't forget that Iran, for decades, financially, logistically mutilated its process around the region of the Middle East, and also the country like Syria under the leadership of Bashar al-Assad, giving oil and gas almost free of charge for them. So all that also challenged the Iranian economy. So not only the sanctions caused the economic crisis Iran has faced since 7-8 years, actually, and very dramatically in the last 2 years, but also Iranian support and the support of the Iranian leadership to the proxies, to Hezbollah, to Amal and other parties in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Syria, and what heavily challenged Iran was the large-scale support for Bashar al-Assad for almost 15 years.
Okay. Doctor, we'll finish up there. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your insight. You're up to date with world news for the hour. Thank you for watching and stay tuned to A News.